Hey guys, welcome back. I am Chris with Marksman Shooting Sports and WeBuyGuns.com in Westfield, Indiana, and you are watching Marksman TV. Welcome back to another weekly used gun review. Remember, in these videos, we take about 8 used firearms that have come into the store, either through our website or through the front door, and give you about a 2 to 5 minute review of each to give you guys an idea of some different stuff out there on the market. Remember, the point of this video is strictly to be entertaining and educational. We are not making this video to sell anything, to keep in accordance with YouTube's policies. So, with all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and jump into it now. Alright, this video is brought to you by our website, WeBuyGuns.com. If you are considering selling a firearm or firearms collection, please log on to our site, create an account, and submit your firearms for an offer request. Now, with that offer, you will get a printable offer certificate, which you can take with you to competing gun stores in your area to try and leverage yourself a better deal. If you're unable to get a better deal, go ahead and sell them to us. We do provide you with a shipping label, and we will pay you with either a paper check or ACH direct deposit, whichever you prefer, to make the process as easy for you as possible. So please remember to go check us out at WeBuyGuns.com. Alright, remember the format of this video is we start with most common and move through least common as the video progresses, starting us off with our first firearm. Now, this is the High Point Model 995 TS. Now, the story with High Point would actually begin back in the early 1990s, specifically around 1992. Now, High Point had a vision of creating a very economically minded firearm, something that the average working person could afford. Now, first in the early 90s, they had started off as sort of the brains behind the manufacturing premise, or at least the design of the handguns that they would first release, how they could make things out of, polymers and zinc alloys and things like that to be very, very inexpensive but durable. And they came out with a series of sort of a philosophy on a handgun design. Now, from that point moving forward, they actually also would get into the manufacturing of their own products, which they are still manufacturing today, about 30 years later. Now, if we get through the 1990s, in 1994, there was a so-called assault weapons ban. Now, this assault weapons ban did have different limitations on the different things that could be used on firearms, like threaded muzzles, whether it's going to have a pistol grip, magazine capacity, and things like that. An assault rifle cannot have more than, I believe it was one of a certain type of what was known as a sort of an evil feature. So in the sort of the mid-1990s, after the passing of the assault weapons ban, High Point wanted to come out with a carbine. They would first release the 995 carbine as a 9mm. They would have different variants through the years and different calibers, like 45 ACP, 10mm, 380 auto. But the 995 9mm was probably the most popular. Now, the so-called first generation High Point carbine looked quite a bit different, and it did conform with the restrictions of the assault weapons ban at the time. I'll roll in a picture for you guys to sort of see what the first generation looked like. It was actually a little bit more sleek and a little bit lighter, in my opinion. In fact, having to pick between the two, I actually kind of like the first gens a little bit more, but that's just me. Now, after the conclusion of the assault weapons ban, they would get to work on coming out with a more modernized version of the carbine. In fact, it was very, very popular because for the new price tag of somewhere between $200 and $300, it was very affordable for a lot of people. And the carbines did not bear the same reputation as the handguns. The handguns are always known to a lot of people as sort of a brick. They're kind of a meme gun nowadays, where people, compare them to boat anchors and things like that. Although the handguns have been proven to be very reliable and very rugged firearms, the carbines never really got the same sort of stigma attached to them. They're always respected as a very good, very, accurate, very reliable, and especially very affordable firearm. And a lot of people, get these things as sort of like ranch hand carbines, small game hunting, depending on what caliber you're using, or just as weekend plankers are excellent firearms. Now, in 2009, they would actually revise the model with the 995 TS. Now, the TS would stand for target stock, and a lot of people would sometimes say it stood for a tactical stock, but I think it's supposed to be target stock, where you have this sort of skeletonized stock with this spring-loaded butt pad on it, which is kind of funny because these are all, pistol caliber. They would thread the muzzles and add different kinds of, rail systems and options on them. They would have options with lasers or a vertical grip. The standard magazine capacity for these stayed at 10 rounds, but a lot of aftermarket magazine manufacturers like Pro Mag have come out with like 15 and 20 round magazines. In fact, I even saw one of them come out with a drum magazine. I saw one available for the 45 ACP that was like 40 rounds or something like that. So they do use the same magazine as the handgun. So a very interesting product that, again, is still on the market today, and people really like to collect and use these for just a various degree of different things. Now, again, on the market today, brand new, you should be able to find them around $200 to $300. Used, actually, they actually hold their value quite a bit. Again, because there's not a lot of, at their price point already, there's not a lot of, there's not a lot of latitude on the bottom end of the price. So you might find them in the 200 range or so, 150 to 200 used. So really cool firearm for the money. Definitely recommend taking a look if you didn't know about the high point carbine. All right, guys, up next is one that is often considered by many in the SIG community as the red-headed stepchild of the SIG handgun lineup. This is the SIG Model P245. It is a 45 ACP semi-automatic handgun double single action feeding from a detachable single stack mag. Now, the P245 is actually based off of the Sig P220. Now, the P220 would come out in 1975 and was intended to replace the P210 in Swiss military service. It was adopted in 1975 by Switzerland and was chambered in 9mm. Now, since then, it has actually become a huge success on the commercial market. It's also been adopted by other police forces around the world, like I believe Japan and Denmark as well. Now, here in the consumer market in the United States, the 45 ACP was the most common round chambered in the P220, but you would also find it in 10mm as well. As like this, it was a single stack. They would later come out with a double stack version, the P227. But the P220 has always really been a staple in SIG's handgun lineup, especially in the larger calibers. People have just always really been fond of that handgun. Now, in the late 90s, SIG wanted to sort of capitalize on that success, as well as the growing demand for small concealed carry handguns. Glock was, of course, in the late 1990s emerging on the scene. And you're starting to get small frame concealable handguns becoming an interest to the consumer market. So SIG in 1999 would release the P245, which is this. It is essentially the P210 that has been cut down on the barrel and on the grip, giving you a smaller package. Now, although a nice, reliable handgun based off of the famous P220 design, the P245 took off sort of like a lead balloon. There were a couple major problems with the design. Number one is, although really nice, very well balanced and reliable, it only held 6 rounds. It's way too heavy for that. Of course, considering other things out on the market, like the Glock Model 30 could hold 10 rounds of 45 ACP and was actually about the same size and had a reduced weight. Later, they would come out with the Glock 36, which was the same capacity but much smaller and much lighter than this. So it just it did not do well in the market given its capacity. Now, you could take P220 magazines that had a higher capacity, I think typically around 8 rounds, and you could fit them in here, but they would stick out the bottom just a little bit. So again, kind of weird to a lot of people. Also, another thing is with the grip being so much shorter on this, I even have small hands and I'm losing the grip at the bottom. It's just not very comfortable. So not as comfortable to a lot of people. The limited capacity just led this to not be a very good seller. In 2006, they would actually discontinue the line, which actually means these are only manufactured for about 7 years, making them actually not too easy to find. But it's one of those that a lot of people aren't really looking for because, again, of the reputation it had. But again, the P245 is the often forgotten pistol from the lineup that not too many people know about. So I kind of wanted to highlight it in this video. Now, the pricing on these in the market is kind of all over the place depending on the condition and what they come with. You typically find them anywhere from $500 to about $800 or so. Which is a typical range on these. But anyway, there you go. Just wanted to share this with you guys on the video, Sig P245. All right, up next is a very interesting firearm. This one coming to us from a viewer in Texas. So thank you so much for selling this one to us. This is a PPS 43C. Specifically, this is a semi-automatic pistol built on a Polish parts kit. We'll talk a little bit about that as we get through it. But the general premise is the PPS 43 from the Soviet Union, which was developed, as the name would suggest, actually in the early 1940s, first being adopted in 42, refined in 43 for mass production. And this would serve as one of the Soviet Union's primary submachine guns through the Second World War. Now, if we look first at the Russian PPD-40, it was one of their first very successful submachine guns. It was a little bit more complicated to produce, so getting into the early years of World War II, they wanted to standardize and simplify on the design, so they would come up with the PPS-H41, the Pepesha, as a lot of people call it, which is really the most iconic Russian submachine gun from World War II. You see it in all sorts of video games and movies. Everybody can definitely pick out a PPS-H41 with the iconic drum magazine, chamber chambered in 7.62 by 25 Tokarev. Now, even that was still a little bit too complicated to produce. Around this time, you have a lot of other countries which are coming up with really quick, easy, and effective submachine gun designs. Like the United States is moving away from the Thompson submachine gun and going to the M3 grease gun. You have Great Britain moving from the Thompson submachine gun to the Sten after Dunkirk. You have Germany going with moving even away from things like the MP38, which was built on a lot of milled parts, going to stampings with the German MP40 submachine gun. So Russia wanted to follow suit, get rid of the wooden furniture, and move to mostly stamped metal parts. Now, in the early 1940s, Alexei Sudyev was tasked with the objective of coming up with a simplified submachine gun for mass production in Russia. Now, first he would come up with a prototype which would actually be adopted in small numbers and produced in small numbers in 1942, and this was the first variation of this submachine gun. Now, due to the siege of Leningrad, it was really shelved. Not a lot were produced, and by 1943 they would actually get it ready for mass production. Now, a couple changes would be made to the PPS-42 to make it more scalable for production, a little bit safer. They would change some of the safety features. They would change some of the barrel shrouding up here at the front. Again, making it very fast for production and relatively safe for more of the conscripted type military. Now, between 1943 and 1945, at least I believe somewhere around 2 million of these would be manufactured, so they were actually very common. And they were being issued in large numbers, although you typically, again, when you play video games and watch movies, it's typically the PPS-H41 that you see. But a very interesting, I mean, again, compared to things like an MP40 or other submachine guns at the time, like the M3 grease gun, in terms of weight and overall ergonomics and feel, it is a very nice, just simple submachine gun type look, feeding from a detachable stick magazine. Now, this was actually so successful that a lot of other countries would adopt this design as well, or at least use certain elements of it. Now, in Vietnam, they came up with the K50M, which looks quite a bit different, but would actually use several design elements from the PPS-43. In Finland, they would adopt this as the M44, in China as the Type 54, and actually in Poland as the PPS-WZ-43, and that's exactly what this is. And in Poland, they would be produced between 1952 and 1955. Now, Pioneer Arms here locally have purchased up a bunch of the PPS-43 parts kits and built them in a semi-automatic configuration with the stock. The stock here would actually collapse open. They actually tack welded here in place, and then the push button to deploy it was actually just replaced with a static pin. So what a lot of people will do is get a parts kit with the rear section intact which we have with this. But you actually have to go through quite a bit. It's actually quite an involved process requiring a lot of work to actually replace those parts with that of a functioning stock. Of course, with all NFA rules in place, making sure you file for your Form 1 before you do any of that work. But a very interesting firearm that surprisingly is overlooked by a lot of people who maybe just have a surface level understanding of firearms used in the Second World War. Typically, the PPS-43 is overlooked. So anyway, very happy to get that in and share it with you guys. It is the PPS-43, or this particular one is a PPS-43C from Pioneer Arms. Okay, up next is a pretty interesting handgun that comes to us from a viewer in Georgia, so thank you so much for selling this one to us. This is a CZ83. Now, this is a pretty rare variant-ish kind of that, and I'll talk a little bit about that here in a minute. Now, the CZ83 was actually a commercial export version of the CZ Model 82. The CZ Model 82 was adopted by Czechoslovakia, current-day Czech Republic, in 1982 as a need to replace the 7.62 by 25 Tokarev, which was chambered in the VZ Model 52 at the time. Very large handgun, very large actual, very high-velocity projectile, the 7.62 by 25 with a little bit of recoil to it. Now, Russia had actually gone to the Makarov pistol following World War II, and a lot of other countries in the region were considering doing something similar. Now, Czechoslovakia had always had an interest in procuring their own armaments, although they would keep close in form and fashion to Soviet-adopted military armaments like the VZ-52 rifle and 7.62 by 45, as opposed to the adoption of the SKS. But if you look at them, they're very similar in principle and philosophy of use. Instead of going to the TT-33 handgun, they went to the VZ Model 52, and instead of going to the Makarov, they adopted this. Now, it is, in principle, very similar to the concepts behind the Makarov pistol. It is a fixed barrel, straight blowback design, much like the PP and the PPK that heavily influenced the Makarov design as well. It is a double single action, just like the Makarov. It has a general same feel and size and sort of weight and handling characteristics as the Makarov. It did use a double stack magazine, whereas the Makarov did use a single stack, so the capacity was definitely advantaged. And it did use the same cartridge as the 9x18 Makarov. Now, CZ, which also had an interest in commercial markets abroad and different security and police markets as well, wanted to come up with a slightly different variation, just in a different chambering that was more common in the West, like the 380 or the 9mm Browning, as it was usually referred to. The 9mm Kurz, as it was referred to in Germany, but they wanted to come up with the 380, which was a round growing in popularity in the United States. Now, for police consumption as well, and for people who are interested in a 32 automatic, they made a very, very small run of CZ83s and 32, and that is what this is. This is actually a 32 automatic CZ83, which are not very easy to find. They're not heads and shoulder above, a CZ83 and 380 in terms of price, just because, the 380 is a more desirable round, but they do add a little bit more value. So an interesting handgun on the market today, CZ83s and 32 automatic, I would say they range in value from about anywhere between $500 and $800, depending on condition and what they come with. Interesting firearms. Definitely love getting CZ82 and 83s in, and I've never had one in 7.65. So very, very cool, and happy to share it with you guys. Okay, up next we have a very interesting pistol coming to us from a viewer in Illinois. So thank you so much for selling this one to us. This is a Mauser Model 1914, chambered in 32 automatic. Now, around the turn of the century, there is a growing demand, especially commercially, for small vest pocket concealed carry firearms, typically in 25 automatic is where you're seeing them. Colt, Browning, FN, a lot of manufacturers around the world are coming out with their own sort of small frame designs, concealed carry designs that are starting to become even more and more popular through about the 19-teens. Now, in about 1906, the Mauser Company, which was a very well-respected brand, they'd come out with the Mauser rifles, things like the C96 pistol, which was one of the first commercially successful semi-automatic handguns. They got to work on coming up with a small frame semi-automatic pistol that would kind of nestle itself into this market. So around 1906, a designer for Mauser, Josef Nickel, would actually come up with a small frame design, first chambered in 25 automatic, and this would be known as the Model 1910. Now, they wanted to, or his, design principles were come up with a design that is easily scalable either up or down in caliber. So you could take the same general design, beef up the sort of the schematics, if you will, on it to accommodate other cartridges. So it's very easy to shoehorn it into other areas of the market on this one simple design. Now, between 1910 and 1913, they would manufacture a ton of these things, the Model 1910 and 25 automatic for the commercial market, and they were a very big success. Now, the 1910 model is actually smaller than this. If you probably scale it down about 20%, that is about the size of the Model 1910. So in 1914, they wanted to come up with another model based on this same design, the Model 1914, chambered in 32, and that is what this was. And this is probably the most common configuration, or the most popular configuration of this overall design. So between 1914 and about 1936, they would manufacture these. Now, these were heavily used in both the First and Second World War, not really seeing military adoption, but would be purchased privately on the commercial market by soldiers and officers and things like that, and kept as a backup, or even in some cases a standard issue sidearm. So very popular in that regard. Now, if we fast forward to the 1930s, in about 1934, Mauser would release a refreshed design on this model. There were a couple subtle changes, not really anything worth noting, but it would be rebranded as the Model 1934. The reason they would do this is other manufacturers are starting to inch into this market that Mauser was really doing a good job of dominating with the 1910 and 1914 designs. You have Sauer coming out with the 38H type pistols, and more importantly, you have Walther coming out with the PP and the PPK in the 1930s, which would really start to dominate this market. Now, they tried to hold on to the market with the Model 1934, but it just was not competing well enough. It was too old, too antiquated technology compared to the new, modern, streamlined PP and PPK pistols. So by 1941, Mauser would actually completely drop this design altogether and come up with a newer innovation themselves known as the Mauser HSC, and that is typically what you see equated with the World War II era and slightly beyond through the 1950s and 1960s from Mauser. Now, these would still be sold commercially and still purchased and used in the Second World War, again as private firearms for officers and general infantry. But by and large, things like the 38H from Sauer, the PP and the PPK pistol, and the Mauser HSC would pretty much be the dominant players moving forward from that era. So this is really a World War I to interwar period is really the heyday of this pistol design. Very, very interesting. If we look at the retail market, as far as like German collectibles, these are actually pretty affordable, and you should be able to find them anywhere between about $400 and $600 or so, depending on condition. I know like premium condition ones with like holsters or bring back paper might squeeze upwards of $1,000, but typical shooter condition, maybe $400 to $600 somewhere in there. So very interesting handguns. Very happy to get this one in, and this one's got quite a bit of finish wear on it, so maybe towards the lower end of that, but very, very cool nonetheless, and happy to get that in and share it with you guys. All right, up next we have a beautiful revolver that comes to us from a viewer in Pennsylvania. So thank you for sending this one to us. This is a Colt Anaconda, and this is one of the 2021 models. 44 Magnum, and this one has an 8-inch barrel. Beautiful revolver. Now the story with this would actually begin during around the time of the 1980s. The 44 Magnum cartridge is gaining a lot of popularity. You did have things like the Smith & Wesson Model 29, and that undoubtedly was sort of what ruled the roost in terms of the large caliber revolvers, but you have other entrants into the market like the Black Hawk and Red Hawk lines from Ruger. Now, Colt was experiencing a tremendous amount of success, especially in the 357 cartridge with their Python revolver lines, which were released in 1955. People love the craftsmanship, the attention to detail on those revolvers, how smooth they were, how easy they were to shoot effectively, and very accurate, very well made revolver. So there began to become a demand from Colt to say, hey, come out with something like the Python, but make it in a 44 Magnum. So Colt would answer the call in 1990 by releasing the Anaconda. Now, the Anaconda was offered in 4, 6, and 8 inches. This is an 8-inch configuration here, and they were all offered in stainless, never in blued. He would effectively take the inner workings of the Python and scale them up. But by the 1990s, a lot of the sort of the hand finishing and hand fitting that was experienced on the Python revolvers, that was sort of starting to become replaced with machinery and sort of assembly line type of manufacturing. And that's more or less how the Anacondas were put together. Now, although they did see some limited success, they would be manufactured from 1990 to about 2003 when the line would be discontinued altogether, actually just a couple years before the Pythons would be replaced as well. By the 90s, they were sort of starting to wear out in terms of demand. The quality that made the snake gun line so popular, again, a lot of that hand fitting stuff was starting to be replaced by machinery, and there's less expensive options that are made similar types of quality in the 357 and the 44 Magnum. So by about the early 2000s, they were pretty well done, and they did discontinue them. Now, in 2020, they would release the Python line, and in 2021, they would release the Anaconda. Now, I actually did a comparison of the old Python versus the new, and I found that, while the new Python is a nice modern production firearm, it doesn't really stack up that well to the kind of the original, 1960s, 70s, or 80s versions of the Python. But actually holding this when comparing it to an original Anaconda, and I do have an original, and I call it original, I mean, they're both Colt guns, but I use the term original to really mean sort of the original manufacturer of the 1990s. But if I compare this to a 1990s Anaconda, I actually find in a lot of ways the stylizing, the look, the feel, the balance, the hammer in some ways is actually an improvement. And I actually want to do a head-to-head comparison of this Anaconda with a 1990s Anaconda, which I actually have. So I will do that probably next week and try and get that video out for you guys, because I'm interested to sort of dive deep into it too. I can see this one's target crown like the new Python. But anyway, a really, really nice, very well balanced, very nice trigger and hammer on this, and just an attractive firearm. I love just how the finish looks on this compared to the 1990 stainless. But anyway, on the market today, I know these things are selling new for about anywhere in the 15 to 17 range. Used might be a hair under that, but they're still not as easy to get to where even the used ones in good condition are holding their value. So you might 13, 14 range maybe. But anyway, very, very nice. Happy to get that in and share it with you guys. That is a 2021 version of the classic Colt Anaconda. Okay, up next is a firearm that I am very fond of, and I gave you guys a teaser of this maybe a month or so ago, and I'm finally getting around to getting it in a weekly used gun review video. But again, thank you to our viewer in Ohio for selling this one to us. This is a Sten 9mm open bolt, and it is transferable. Very interesting firearm, and I think is one of the best examples of wartime manufacturer ingenuity that there has ever been. Now, why was this an example of wartime ingenuity? Well, we can go back to the very famous evacuation of Dunkirk. At Dunkirk, you had French, British, and Belgian troops that were pushed up against the shores of northern France as they were being pursued by General von Rundstedt and his Army Group A. Now, as they were sort of isolated at the port of Dunkirk, von Rundstedt put out a halt order on any further military action on the ground, as he didn't want to risk losing any more, war material, equipment, or men, as it was pretty obvious that, okay, this is going to be basically shooting fish in a barrel. They have nowhere to go. They have no escape. Let's just send in the Luftwaffe to finish them off from the air. And that's the order that was given. Now, this actually gave British, French, and Belgian troops, mostly British, an opportunity to escape across the English Channel back home. Now, very quickly, they had actually rescued 300,000 men in a very makeshift sort of at-home rescue order where, private citizens with their fishing boats and other types of, water-worthy sea vessels would actually be able to get people back home, and they did. It was a huge success, and they were very, very lucky that they were able to do that. However, left behind was a ton of war material and equipment, guns, ammo. So, of course, their major interest was getting the troops home and, saving as much room as we can on these small, water vessels, for guns and ammo and things like that. So now you have all the troops back home, and that's great, but then you have Germany teeing up against the northern end of France across the English Channel for what would eventually lead into the invasion of Great Britain itself. You have the War of Britain, which was mostly fought by air, but it was obviously going to be inevitable that there was going to be a ground invasion at some time. Now, with a very limited supply of armaments, they did go over to the United States and try to get more military equipment. You have Savage Company making things like the Enfield under the Lend-Lease Act with the U.S. property markings on them, and there were Thompson submachine guns being manufactured as well. Now, the problem is by 1941, just a year later, when there is the demand for armament in Great Britain is huge, the United States enters the war. They need to start, shifting their production to start beefing up the United States military, which at the time was using a lot of World War I technology. So they're trying to get more of their contracts for Thompson submachine guns for themselves and get production for, later the M1 Garands with the 1903 Springfields. They're trying to tee up a bunch of production at home in the United States as well for what was happening in the Pacific Theater. So as the supply of submachine guns from the United States was waning, they had thought, okay, well, maybe we can go back to the Lancaster design, which was a British adaptation of the German MP-28, which was World War I technology, mostly all milled and machined parts, beautiful bluing. It was sort of an interwar machine gun with this nice walnut stocks. So our options are we can keep spending $200 a unit with the United States and not get much supply. We can revert production back to very expensive and overly complicated and dated submachine gun technology, or we can come up with something that's going to be cheap, easy, and effective to build. So that's what they did. There were two designers, Shepard and Turpin, who would actually end up coming up with the ultimate design of this in 1941, and it would be produced at Enfield, and that's how you get the name. S for Shepard, T for Turpin, EN for Enfield, or Sten. It was a 9mm submachine gun feeding from a detachable box magazine fed into the left-hand side, and it was an open bolt. Now, for storage purposes, you could pull on this little thing and turn it down, but of course you could not feed it that way. It was meant to be fed from the left-hand side. Some advantages of this is so that you could lay prone and not worry about your magazine getting in the way. Overall, some of the biggest complaints about this design was the magazine. It was a double column single feed, and it did have some feeding issues. And other than that, though, it was actually, even though looking very crude and very easy to manufacture, it was actually very effective. Now, this would be, by comparison, $200 for an American Thompson. This was about $11 to manufacture and took about 5 man-hours. So it was very, very quick to make. Now, they would have the Mark I through the Mark V as the war would continue. They would come up with more simplified versions. The most common one is this one, and this is a Mark II. The Mark V would actually use an Enfield stock and have a vertical grip and an Enfield front sight, Enfield rifle, I should say, front sight assembly. But they would try and improve on the design, simplify, and make better the design of this. You had a little safety notch up here in the back. you could push this through to make it safe. So it's just very, very simple, very rugged. You have a tube, you have all stamped parts, a little bit of welding. There's like 47 parts in all inside of a Sten. So very interesting design, very genius in terms of wartime ingenuity. With that simplification, they were able to make millions of these and get them in the hands of soldiers very quickly. And that's what made this quick production type very effective. Not only that, they were able to drop them behind German lines in France to French resistance fighters. So these are very popularly used with them as well. And in fact, Germany was so impressed with this, they would kind of create their own sort of version of this as well back home domestically, which they would produce in bigger numbers towards the end of the war, as they were so cheap and easy to manufacture, even compared to their stamped MP40. So very, very cool firearm, very interesting, and happy to get this in and share it with you guys. Now, pricing on these is a little bit weird. Being a transferables, typically if it's a CNR, which means original British manufacturer, those are typically in about the $10,000 to $12,000 price range right now. This is what is known as a tube gun. So before the 1986 sort of halting of manufacture of machine guns, there was a couple manufacturers who would basically make the tubes and then build the rest of the firearm on the tube. So it's not considered CNR, not as collectible, but still as a shooter, they're great. And those typically will run you anywhere between $7,000 to $8,000 right now in the market. So very cool, very happy to get that in and share it with you guys. The Sten 9mm submachine gun. All right, last but not least is a firearm that needs no introduction. This is a German World War II era MP40. This one is a transferable, and we did purchase it from a local customer, so thank you so much for selling this one to us. These are very iconic, very interesting firearms. I've had one before, and I've done very extensive videos on them. In fact, since we have, the Sten, and I've got a couple other, World War II era open bolt submachine guns, I want to do a head-to-head comparison of a few of those, so we'll do these in kind of future videos for you guys. But essentially the story with this would begin back in 1938. Now, Germany was actually starting to get ready to gear up for war. They would, of course, invade Poland a year later in 1939. They had started looking at the tactical doctrines of Blitzkrieg or lightning war, this very quick, rapidly moving, very mechanized, advanced type of warfare where you get in and you sort of isolate, cut off, and destroy your enemy very, very quickly. Now, because of that, they were going to need a very quick production of firearms. They wanted to move away from the nice machine steel and things like that, like things that were seen on the MP18, the earlier generation of submachine guns from World War I, or the so-called Bergmann machine guns. And they wanted to move into something that was going to be quicker and easier to produce. Now, Heinrich Vollmer had actually come up with a simplified design, which was the predecessor to the MP40, known as the MP38. While it did cut down on production costs, it would start to incorporate the use of things like Bakelite and very simple, metal sort of wire stocks. It would still use a lot of heavily machined parts. They were able to scale production in 1938, and they were in the hands of a lot of infantrymen by 1939, but still the production time and cost of manufacturing, especially with a very much needed war material, steels and metals for all sorts of weapons and equipment, it was too great and didn't quite achieve what was desired for a new, very easily produced, somewhat disposable submachine gun. So Vollmer would go back to the drawing board and try and look at ways to reduce manufacturing. Now, there was still a lot of machine parts on the MP38. Not only that, there was also some safety issues. The MP38 had somewhat of a hooked charging handle that didn't have any type of safety knot, so it was very normal where charging handles would get snagged enough to let go, and then you would start running away the machine gun as it was on a soldier's back, potentially shooting at his squad behind him, or himself exiting an armored vehicle or a half-track or something like that. So we needed to increase production time, reduce production costs and material, and also make the firearm more safe. So by 1940, he came up with a revised design, which was the 1940. Now, even though that this is referred to a lot of people as the Schmeiser, it had really nothing to do with Hugo Schmeiser. He did not design or produce it. Again, this was designed by Heinrich Vollmer and was produced at Erma, Heinel, and Steyr. This particular one is a Heinel, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Now, by 1940, he had moved a lot of the milled production to almost extensively and entirely stamped parts. Everything on the MP40 is stamped except for the barrel and the bolt. I think are the only parts. I might be mistaken. There might be a couple small parts, but 95% of this is stamped. Very easy, very cheap to produce. Now, on the early release of the 1940, there were still some holdover features from the MP38. the way that the muzzle nut was kept on and retained with a wire, like sort of a wire locking mechanism, was still retained on the early MP40. You still had that unsafe hooked type of charging handle. The magazine, while had very much of a slab side type look like this one does, now on the MP38 they would actually cut lightning holes into the side of it. It's kind of a quick way you can tell you're looking at an MP38, that and the corrugated steel look of the receiver tube itself. And that, I believe, is about it. Now, as production would go on from about 1941 to 1942, they would further simplify on the design. They would actually reinforce the mag well by putting what I want to call ribs into the side of the mag well, reinforcing the strength. They would actually go to a simplified muzzle nut and captive retaining wire, which actually this one has. And then they would go to the biggest improvement, which was the sort of cylindrical type charging handle that does have a safety notch you can push in, and it locks it from moving. So when in transit, it can be locked in and you can't snag that charging handle and force it to fire, which was actually one of the biggest improvements on the design. Now, this one in particular is an FXO code. They would use codes to hide the manufacturing names, but FXO is Hynel, and this was made in 1941 and is known somewhat as a transitional MP40. So it is obviously part of the MP40 family, not the MP38, but it has a lot of the very first MP40 features, such as the slab side mag. I shouldn't say a lot, it has one. It has the slab side mag well, but it has the later MP40 features like the new muzzle nut system and the new charging handle. And this is an all matching example. So kind of a mix of early MP40 and later MP40 features, which is pretty cool. Now, of the three manufacturers, Hynel made the least, Steyr made the most. So being an early transitional Hynel that is all matching, this is actually pretty rare. So very, very cool. I want to use this in future videos, but I did want to take the opportunity to go ahead and give you guys just sort of a sneak history, or quick history on the MP40. So there is that one. And oh, again, if we go over price, again, they did make the tube guns for the MP40s as well, as like they did on the Sten, where you have a parts kit built on a domestically manufactured tube, and that was common in the 1970s and 80s. And then CNR. This is an all original CNR MP40, and something like this, you know, the range on price is usually, I've seen them anywhere between about $25,000 and $30,000. They're very expensive. Tube guns you're seeing around 17 to 20 or so right now. So anyway, very happy to share that with you guys and get it in, and I will do more videos in the future. Well, that is all I have for you today on these. Thank you so much for stopping by and checking out this video. If you enjoyed, please let me know by hitting that like button. Please also consider subscribing to my channel and hit that bell notification button so you are aware when I am posting new content. Anyway, guys, I'm going to leave you off with that. I am Chris with Marksman Shooting Sports and WeBuyGuns.com in Westfield, Indiana. You are watching Marksman TV, and I will see you next time.